Well, it is 7:31, which means we're officially into our meeting time. Good evening, everyone. How's it going? All right, great. Welcome to the Hamilton Naturalist Club's one of two monthly meetings that we host. My name is Jackson Hudecki. I am the president of the board of directors. Wow, all right. Perhaps that woo came because just 1 month ago was our AGM, and a big transition happened where some folks, their term was up, some folks moved on, and we welcomed a whole new slate of people, and I became the president of the board. So I was the past vice president, so I'm happy to now be the pres. So it's a 2-year term, and we have a lot of fun things planned. In fact, there are several board members in the room. If you're on the board, can you just raise your hand? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here. We've got a full slate for the first time in as long as I can remember. I've been on the board since 2017, and we have a full roster. Our board is completely full of 15 people, which is incredible because that just shows that there's a lot of people who care a lot about nature. When I look around the room tonight, I see a room full of people who care about nature, so I'm so excited that you're here. Raise your hand if this is your first time coming to an HNC meeting. Heck yeah, welcome. All right. So just some quick facts. We're 106 years old. So we started in 1919, and we've been buying land in Ontario to be protected and preserved forever. So we've got 11 nature sanctuaries, which total about 550 acres of land. And we're not going anywhere, and we're not changing that MO for what it's worth. We're going to keep on doing what we can to preserve and protect nature in and around the Hamilton area. Some of our properties aren't even in Hamilton. Like, we've got one, and it's our original property. It's kind of down near Long Point. We've got another one that is down Niagara Way. So we've been trying to do what we can to just say nature needs a place where nature can be. A lot of people are like, great, where can I go hike it? And some of our sanctuaries don't have any trails on them because they're not meant for us. They're meant for nature to exist without us, which is something that's really important. We need spots where it can do its thing naturally without the pressures of people, because let's face it, we put a lot of pressure on nature. And we put a lot of pressure on each other, which is also why it's good to come here to just kind of exist in a space where we're learning something that maybe we haven't before, and that's what we try and do here. Not only do we have these meetings, which can be about anything, we also have the bird study group meetings. So Rob over there is our bird study group director, and so once a month we also, yeah, woo to Rob. We also bring in a speaker that pertains just up to birds. We've got so many. Are there any birders in the room? Show of hands. All right, great. So we also recognize there's lots of bird experts in the community, and so we try and bring out speakers for that, which is great. Also part of our board is, and someone who is new, is Natalie Kemp. Natalie, is that you at the back of the room there? So Natalie's job is to be bringing speakers to you once a month. And is this your very first one that you planned from, or is... September's, that's right. September's, last month was the AGM, and then all of these henceforth. So we're excited to have Natalie on board. So thank you, Natalie, for being you. We also have a volunteer director. Where's Kate? So Kate is, yes, round of applause for Kate. Kate is our volunteer director, and so if you are someone who feels that you've got extra time in your life, or you really care about nature and you don't have time in your life and you try to fit it in where you can and you want to help out, you can talk to Kate, or just take a look at our website, because we have a whole bunch of stuff going on that you can take part in that help nature in the long run. I'm going to talk about a few of those in a second. I don't think Celine is here, but Peter is here. Where's Peter? Peter's right there. So yay, Peter. So Celine and Peter are involved with organizing outings for the club. So several times a month, there will be a chance where there's a hike leader taking people out and talking about and insert subject matter here, because we have so many subject matter experts, and I shouldn't even say experts, I should say beginners or intermediates, because people who just care and know a lot about something can run outings. And so Peter and Celine help put those together, promote it all over our website and social media, and that way people who want to be involved can. You don't have to be a member, but we'd love you to be one. So it's, I think, $50 a year to be a member, and it helps pay for rooms and speakers and wood duck and you know, a few other things as part of our offerings. So your membership money goes a long way. We currently have 370 members, which is great. It's one of the highest that we've been in years. And I was told the breakdown is like 75 family memberships, 91 senior joint memberships, 119 senior single memberships, and 85 just single memberships. So that is pretty great. So we love to see that number climb, because everything that we're doing is to, like I said, involve people protecting nature and getting involved with the awareness of that. Perhaps you've been following the news and seeing what is occurring in the province right now as it pertains to conservation authorities. So if you don't know, essentially they're kind of disbanding the governing body of the 36 conservation authorities and amalgamating them into 7, which is chaotic to say the least. So if you know someone who works in a conservation authority, or you go hiking in conservation areas, check in on those people and go hiking in those spaces. But also, if you don't like that plan, feel free to say something. They're accepting comments from the public right now. They're already broken up by watersheds, which is the most important thing. So that way the governing bodies, those authorities are ensuring that what happens around those watersheds, which eventually impacts what happens downstream, are all under a good watchful eye. We're not quite sure what's going to happen with that. I don't know enough about it to comment further than it's tricky. So take a look at any of your local sources of people talking about nature, particularly Ontario Nature. They're a great source for environmental activism if you haven't already checked them out. Okay, I'll pull back from that for a second. Also just mention that if you are at home, hello, we are live streaming on YouTube. If you are a YouTube member, consider subscribing to the Naturalist Club, because we're trying to get to a point where if it calls for it, we could be monetized from it. And I think we need 1,000 subscribers, or 500. What's that? 500. And we're at what right now?
430.
All right, great. So if everyone in this room started subscribing to the Naturalist Club's YouTube channel, that would be great. And then if you ever want to watch any of these meetings down the road, you couldn't attend the live talk, or you're at home and it's a snowy night, or you're just unable to get it, you can still attend these talks online. So how many are online right now, do you know? 15. Hello to all 15 of you and your families and friends who are watching. We really appreciate it. So, and thanks to Rob for setting. One more round of applause for Rob. I do have someone to bring up in a second, but I'm just going to go through a couple of these slides. So if this is your first time here, 7 to 7:30 is that kind of mingling window, and we do have refreshments. So Ellen and Anne and Dina put together snacks for people to enjoy. If you have a couple pennies in your pocket, feel free to throw that in, so that just pays for future food and drinks. Was anybody perhaps out at the Corktown on Saturday night? Got a couple? All right, great. We had our third ever fundraiser for the Naturalist Club. This year it was titled Rock for Nature. So there was a great cover band called Buff Orpington who played 3 sets. I know the name's a little unusual. They admitted it to me. It's a type of chicken apparently, but so it is bird related. But these hunks played 3 sets and they wowed the place, and they had people dancing, which was incredible. And I think we raised near $800 that night. So it was a great way to kind of bring music and nature together, and we look forward to doing this again next year. I think Tom, who is on the left hand, fourth over, second from the left, Tom is the driver behind these nights, and he is trying to put together a kind of conservation band for next year. People who are in the nature community who are musicians to form a type of cover band for next year. So if you want to get involved with that, reach out to the Naturalist Club. And one of the last things I wanted to share before talking about some other events coming up is that for the first time ever, the Naturalist Club has contracted an organization called Civic Plan to lead us through our first ever strategic plan. So like nature, we've been a little chaotic for 106 years, and we've been taking on projects left, right, and center, bringing in funds where we can to support our staff. We have 2 staff members who are handling the lion's share of the work, but as well as the working board, to now bring in a group who's going to say, okay, let's talk about what the future looks like for the Naturalist Club. And that's going to involve all of you. So if you're a member, and if you're about to become a member, this is great because we will be accepting input from the community about where you want us as your local nature club to focus our attention. Like I said, we have 11 nature sanctuaries. We may continue to buy more if the club's like, please keep buying land. We want you to protect as much of it as possible. But maybe you're going to say, we want more of A, B, C, or D. And we can then understand what our member base wants and then start to provide that because we all work better together. So you'll be seeing that name Civic Plan more and more. They might come to a few meetings and present a little bit to us just to keep providing that context. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that. Some events coming up, there are a few. So I'm leading a walk this Saturday, the 15th, from 9:30. It says 11:30. It might end up going till noon. I haven't checked the weather. It might go until 9:45, but likely not. I'm going to try and push through whatever, unless it's like really raining. But anyway, we're going to meet at the Urquhart Butterfly Garden on Saturday morning at 9:30. And then my goal is to kind of go through the garden, cross the road, do the whole Spencer Creek Trail, and then it doubles back to the lights, cross at the lights, and then go through the Canal Park and back to the parking lot. So, and then we'll just look at whatever birds we can find and maybe some fish, who knows. So maybe you'll come out for that. It is a BYO binocular situation. We don't have any, so it's great if you have yours, but you can also just walk. It's fine. We have an invasive shrub poll, so on this Saturday as well, so they are competing. So either you're birding or you're using your muscles. Either way, we would love for you to help take part in this invasive shrub poll so that we can make room for lots of native species. Let me leave this up here for a sec before I talk about the next 2 things, because there is an initiative happening through our MPP's office. So, no.
Ward office.
Oh, the ward office. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Let's give a round of applause to Jessica to give us an update.
Hi, folks. Yes, I am here from the Ward 3 office to speak a little bit about an upcoming council meeting that we have, and we are asking for public input. So about 2 years ago, I'm also not off script, so I'm just going to be reading right from here. About 2 years ago, the City of Hamilton councillors Narinder Nan and Councillor Wang, with the help of council staff, put forward a motion to City Council requesting the feasibility to study and explore less polluting alternatives to traditional fireworks that the city uses at Canada Day events. Ultimately, the motion passed, but it was met with a lot of backlash that diverted the focus away from its main point of the motion. The motion's intent was to highlight that noise and explosions from the traditional fireworks are damaging to the natural environment, toxic to the air, the land, the water, disturbing to domestic animals as well as wildlife, marine life, and can be upsetting to survivors of trauma and conflict. Besides these factors, we know that in addition to the year-round industrial air pollution, wildfire smoke that's becoming the new normal in the summers that coincides with Canada Day celebrations. Since the pass of this motion in November 2023, the feasibility study has had little change, and the staff are citing challenges such as cost prohibitives, alternatives like drones and laser shows, the lack of availability of the suppliers, and the lack of concerns from Hamiltonians. That's where you come in. You are concerned about fireworks. We know that many residents are in fact concerned about fireworks and have been asking what more can we do to move the needle on this matter, with some of them calling for all-out ban on traditional fireworks citywide. We are now bringing the conversation to you, Hamiltonians, to join us again in calling on City of Hamilton to take this seriously and to commit to being leaders in climate change, and to stop using traditional fireworks at city-run events. So now you're thinking, what can I do? Here's your answer. Email your city councilors. Tell them your thoughts on traditional fireworks. You can CC the Ward 3 office, so it's ward3@hamilton.ca, and let us know that you're on board with us. You can also contact our office to delegate at the upcoming city council meeting, where you can look the councilors in the eyes. It's really fun to delegate. I'll coach you. And tell them what you think about air pollution and what you think about nature and how you want to save it. You can also work with your local community groups if you've got a little neighborhood Facebook group, or say you're a member of a naturalist club. You can talk to your neighbors about fireworks and what they do to the environment. So yeah, if you have any questions, I will be here after the meeting and I'm happy to discuss further. Thank you so much.
It's interesting, the timing of let's light off fireworks always coincides with birds have landed, are picking their breeding territory, maybe even have young on the nest. This does work, and I'll tell you why real quick before I introduce our speaker. So years ago, McMaster University, on the last day of classes, they used to have, I think it was called Light Up the Night, and they would shoot off fireworks that night, and it coincided, and I don't know how long it was happening for, but this is around the same time that bald eagles had returned to Coots Paradise and were nesting on Coots. And if you recall, that was a huge moment in nature to have these eagles. It was the first time in over 50 years they were nesting on the shores of Lake Ontario, and they were nesting right on campus. And every year they kind of go back and forth from the North Shore to the South Shore. Anyway, RBG at the time, because it's their property that surrounds Coots Paradise, said these fireworks are disturbing the eagles that have finally chosen to nest here. And they were like, are you sure? Are you sure it's doing that? So they then conducted decibel level reading tests, and some birders went out at night and used scopes to watch what the eagles did. And sure enough, when the fireworks went off, the eagles left the nest, leaving the young open to predation. And what eats baby eagles? Great horned owls, which are also nesting around Coots Paradise. So they were able to say, look at what happened, look at what's happening, let's sign something together that says you will no longer do this, and they don't. So that's just proof that people power matters. So thank you, Jessica, for bringing that forward. I know that when my dog was alive, she absolutely hated fireworks, or firecrackers, I should say. I think there's a difference between the two. But regardless, I'm glad to see that coming forward. So thank you. Okay. So as I mentioned, there are 2 meetings happening a month. So 1 week from tonight is the Bird Study Group meeting, and our special guest will be James Lees. And so if you don't know James, he's an incredible birder and naturalist. He works for the Hamilton Conservation Authority in Dundas Valley, and he takes trips around the world. And so the talk next week is going to focus on a recent trip of his. I will share that there is a family member of James's who is unwell, and there's a chance that this subject matter may change, but the meeting will go on regardless next week. So if you all of a sudden are seeing something else and you're looking forward to this talk and James can no longer do it, there'll be something equally cool in place. Okay. And then our next month's regularly scheduled meeting is going to be Drawn from Nature, Woman Artists and Botanical Works. So that's on December 8th, right back here. And Natalie Scola will be our special guest. And Natalie's been leading, this is not our Natalie, it's a different Natalie, has been leading this talk for a few months, and it is captivating, so hopefully we will see you back for this. And at any point you need any more information on us, check our website or on social media, look for Hamilton Nature on Instagram or on Facebook. Now tonight's speaker is an artist and naturalist currently based in Toronto. She's been involved with a number of environmental organizations, including the Bamfield Marine Sciences Centre and the Royal Ontario Museum. She's a part of the Feminist Bird Club and helps lead events with the Toronto chapter, maybe the Hamilton chapter at some point too. Currently, she's directing a feature-length queer ecology documentary called Understanding Myself as an Amphibian. Everybody put your hands together for tonight's speaker, Matchim.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's nice to be in Hamilton. All right, so as I was introduced, my name is May, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about queer ecology. I have two species here which are probably familiar for a lot of people in the room. We have Jack in the Pulpit, a local native wildflower, and then the green frog. And those are two great examples of species which can challenge some of our presumptions that we carry about the sex binary and about heteronormativity and things like that. So we'll get into both of those pretty soon. So who am I? So we talked a little bit about this in the introduction. I am not a biologist. I went to school to study film. I did a post-grad program through Fleming College called Environmental Visual Communications after I finished my bachelor's degree. And I got to do a lot of work at the ROM, and I ended up working there, and I volunteered there for many years, teaching members of the public, particularly kids. I've worked at a number of environmental nonprofits, and I'm a filmmaker, and currently working on a documentary, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. And I'm a queer person, I'm a transgender woman, which also sort of informs my view of the world and my relationship with nature. Yeah, let's get into queer ecology. So what is queer ecology? So it's sort of a loose field or group of practices. As a term, it first emerges in the early 1990s. And one of the key figures in the development of queer ecology is a professor at York University named Dr. Catriona Sandilands. And a lot of her writings in the early 90s are sort of pivotal to the development. Another real milestone was in 1999, this book was published by a Canadian biologist named Bruce Bagamo. It's called Biological Exuberance. And for the first time, somebody really compiled sort of a list of all these instances in the scientific literature of same-sex sexual behavior, so homosexual behavior in wildlife. And for a long time, there was this real perception that it was rare, or maybe it was a mistake on the animal's part, or it was an example of an aberrant individuals that were sick or diseased somehow. But publishing this book, it's like a huge book that can like keep a door open, like it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, extremely exhaustive. It really helped shift the needle within the scientific community, even though a lot of those biases persist today. It really helped change public perception and perception within science. So that was really huge. As I mentioned, it's sort of a broad field. It encompasses a wide variety of practices, including academia and research, as well as art, activism. And it's starting to gain greater public recognition. In the past few years, we've seen a number of documentaries, television specials, books, articles, podcasts, things like that are starting to come out. So people are starting to pay more and more attention to this and become interested with it. So to help put things into perspective, and I've included some in-text citations here because I've given variations on this presentation before, and sometimes people are like, who is this woman making this stuff up? So these are all scientific publications and peer-reviewed papers and things like that that you can look up if you want to. Homosexual behavior has been scientifically documented in over 1,500 species, according to a paper published in 2019, including all of these species on the bottom there, all of which are found in Ontario. Same-sex sexual behavior occurs in every major group of animals, including mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, amphibians, arachnids, and over 500 species of fish can actually change their sex. Homosexual behavior has been scientifically reported in over 260 species of mammals, including all of these mammals here, including some that we're probably familiar with, like the little brown bat and the eastern gray squirrel and the red fox. There's over 130 bird species which participate in same-sex sexual behavior. Again, all of these species shown here, which are all found in Ontario, things like the American kestrel, black-crowned night heron, many, many species of gulls and waterfowl, the hooded warbler. And there's a really interesting and diverse range of behaviors in which this can include that Bruce Bagamill did a really great job of outlining in that book, Biological Exuberance. So that includes things like courtship and pair bonding. You can see this nice photo series on the side there of two male mallards courting one another. A really cool example of this, which has a strong Ontario connection, is that little shorebird in the lower corner there on the right. That's a piping plover. And back in 2021, at Darlington Provincial Park, near Oshawa, there was two female piping plovers that courted one another for the first time in scientific history that was observed. And that became a real point of celebration for the plover enthusiasts and the biologists. So it's extremely cute that that happened so close to here, and yeah, it's something people are very proud of and very happy about. But all the species here, we have the eastern bluebird there. There's been reports of male eastern bluebirds courting one another by presenting insects to one another the same way that they court females, and it happens in a number of species of waterfowl as well. So it seems to be a pretty common behavior across many different species of birds and mammals. Nest building in a number of species, including the great cormorant, which is a species we have out on the east coast of Canada as well as throughout Europe, and the Canada goose. There's same-sex nest building. And parenting, this is really interesting. We'll get into a little bit more detail with this in a second, but all of these species here have been scientifically reported as engaging in same-sex parenting. And they form pair bonds, they go through courtship, and then they can raise young together. It seems to be particularly common with female-female gull pairs. And I don't think we're entirely sure why, but it seems to be common with gulls. Now there's a number of sort of linguistic and conceptual challenges that we have to sort of think about and sit with for a second, because it can get a little bit tricky to think about this stuff. One of the main sort of critiques that sometimes gets leveled at this kind of work is anthropomorphism. So when we assign uniquely human characteristics to non-human organisms. We try to be as objective as possible when we're doing science, but we're never completely objective. We all carry our biases, our worldviews, and things like that. And that shapes the way that we understand animal behavior and we report on it. There's lots of examples in the scientific literature of terms like dance, very human-centric terms being applied to animals. With elephant seals, they talk about male elephant seals having harems. With monogamous birds like albatrosses, they talk about them experiencing divorce when those long-term partnerships end sometimes. So there seems to be a real double standard sometimes of critique where people are happy to criticize same-sex sexual behavior as being, you're applying a human behavior to these animals, you're bringing a human lens to it, but that same level of critique doesn't always exist when it's different sex sexual behavior. It's also difficult for us to speculate about the inner lives of non-human animals. Like, how does a gull understand itself? How does it understand how it moves through the world and how it relates to other animals? It's fundamentally unknowable to us. What counts as homosexual behavior is also an interesting sort of conceptual problem. According to different scientists, it can encompass different things. Sometimes it's very narrow, that definition, and sometimes it's much broader, like the one that Bruce Bagamill employed in his book, which includes things like courtship and raising young together. And like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of persisting sort of biases and double standards where if the same behavior is observed in different sexed animals, it's unquestionably accepted by scientists as being sexual. But if it's two animals of the same sex doing the exact same thing, engaging in the same behavior, a lot of the time there is an additional skepticism or an additional need to sort of prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what's going on. So one of the things I mentioned a second ago was the idea of same-sex parenting in animals. And some people might be wondering, how do two same-sex animals have young together? So here are two examples of two different birds that we have here in Ontario, the hooded warbler and the ring-billed gull. And they provide two different and really interesting examples of how this can happen. So there are male-male hooded warbler couples that will raise young together. And sometimes what will happen is a female hooded warbler will lay her eggs in a nest, and something like a chipmunk or a squirrel or a snake will come along and will attack the nest or take one of the eggs. And this usually causes the female hooded warbler to abandon the nest altogether. So there will be eggs that are left abandoned. And it's been observed by scientists in the field that these male-male hooded warbler couples will come along and will sometimes adopt these abandoned eggs and will sort of serve as foster parents. The other mechanism through which two male hooded warblers can raise a baby together is through brown-headed cowbirds. This is something else that's been observed by scientists. So it's sort of an interesting nest parasitism adoption situation there. Ring-billed gulls are really interesting because they nest colonially. They nest in big groups of hundreds of gulls. If anyone's ever been to somewhere like Presqu'île or Tommy Thompson Park in Toronto, you might have seen this. And some of the research about same-sex female pairings of ring-billed gulls was actually done back in the 1980s at Presqu'île, which is kind of cool. Sometimes those two female ring-billed gulls, when they form a pair together, are totally monogamous. And then sometimes one of them will also mate with a male outside of that pair, and they're actually able to have a viable egg and raise young together. And when scientists compare the success of those clutches with the success of differently sexed ring-billed gull couples, there was no difference in the success of the parenting or the viability of the eggs or anything like that. The other mechanism through which gulls sometimes are able to raise young in these female-female pairings is in some species they will actually steal the eggs from other couples. So they will sort of kidnap an egg, which is a little problematic, but we can forgive them. Another sort of interesting conceptual linguistic challenge that we should work through is the difference between gender and sex, and whether animals are capable of experiencing or having gender and what that might look like. Some biologists like Joan Roughgarden, who wrote a book called Evolution's Rainbow, have argued that animals are capable, possibly, of experiencing gender or have some form of gender. Oftentimes, sort of in day-to-day vernacular speech, we use these terms interchangeably, but biologists, social scientists, historians, they like to sort of differentiate between the two. So sex, usually we think about it relating to physical characteristics, things like hormones, chromosomes, external anatomy. So something like male or female we would understand to be different sex categories. Whereas gender relates to how we understand ourselves and how we relate to one another in a more social context, how we view ourselves internally, how we interact with other people around us, and the roles we take on socially. So a category like woman or man would be a gender identity. So here are two organisms, one of which is native to Ontario and one of which we get here occasionally in migration. The bluegill, which is a type of sunfish. And there's been some really interesting research, again, going back to the 1980s in Lake Opeongo in Algonquin Park, which is a place some of you have probably been to, about the different types of male bluegills. So there's three types of these male fish. There's the large male bluegill, the medium-sized one, and the small one. And they are very different in terms of morphology, the size of their bodies, and very different socially. So the large male bluegills are extremely aggressive. They'll court females by sort of doing this swimming dance around them, and then they get to spawn with them, and they will aggressively defend the nest and the eggs. The small bluegills, they sneak in there and they will fertilize some of the eggs after the females laid them and try not to get chased away by the dominant, like larger males. So they have a completely different strategy and a completely different way of relating to the other fish. What's really interesting are the medium male bluegills, which some biologists have nicknamed the marriage brokers. They're a little bit more peaceful, and they will do something resembling the courtship sort of swim dance thing with the large males. So they'll form a bond with the large males. And when the large males and the medium males go together to court one of the females, they're more successful. The large males are very aggressive and they will sometimes bite and attack their female mates, but when they have the medium male with them, they're much more peaceful. It calms them down a little bit. And so they have this weird cooperative sort of throuple situation going on. Again, they're all male, these three types of bluegills, but they all have very different bodies, very different ways of relating to the other fish socially. So it raises really interesting questions about whether animals can possess gender. This other organism we have here is a shorebird called the ruff, which is native to Eurasia, but sometimes in Ontario we'll get one in the fall or the spring that gets a little bit lost. They'll show up at Long Point and 200 people will come with their scopes. All the female ruffs basically look very similar, but again, like the bluegills, there's 3 different types of male ruffs. And kind of like grouse, they have a lek system for courting their mates, where a bunch of males will meet in one area and put on these elaborate dances and displays to try to impress the females. And there's one type of male ruff called the independent, who's the really showy one, and he has these really big, impressive feathers. And they're the most dominant, the most aggressive. They take up the most space on the lek. And then there's the satellites, and they're a little less showy, and they're sort of around the periphery. And every once in a while, one will be able to get in and mate with one of the females. But they have a less dominant social role. What's really interesting is there's a third type called the fader, or female mimic, which looks just like a female ruff, and they're able to sort of be in the lek unnoticed because all the other ruffs think they're another female, and that's their mechanism through which they're able to court and mate the females. So again, they're all male, but they have 3 very different body plans, very different morphology, and very different sort of social functions and understandings of themselves. Another concept which is really important to this discussion is that of sexual dimorphism. So most of us grow up learning that male birds are the more colorful, showy ones, and the females are a little bit more drab and less showy looking. So the classic example of that is the northern cardinal, where we have the red male, and then we have this sort of brownish orange female that's a little less flamboyant looking. But there's a lot of interesting examples of birds that subvert this, and other organisms as well. Sexual dimorphism can be any sort of physical difference between different sexes of the same species. So a female giant squid could be twice as large as a male, and that's an example of sexual dimorphism. Or these different colors and different patterns is another good example of that. There are some birds and other organisms as well, as we'll talk about, including different arachnids and arthropods and insects, which are called gynandromorphs. And in these individuals, they can be perfectly divided down the middle, half male and half female. This is a photograph taken in Erie, Pennsylvania in 2019 by a birder named Shirley Caldwell. And you can see there that that cardinal is perfectly divided. It's half male on one side and half female on the other. Last year, I got to go to the collections of the Museum of Nature in Gatineau, and I got to see this evening grosbeak specimen. And once again, you can see when you compare it to the pictures of the sexually dimorphic male and female that are different colors, it's perfectly divided down the middle. And the tag even noted, ovary on left side, testy on right. So it's not just an issue of plumage, it's the internal anatomy as well. What's really interesting is we only very recently figured out how this actually happens. So most bird egg cells have a single nucleus, but some occasionally will have 2 nuclei. And if there's a sperm carrying 2 Z chromosomes, which we associate with male birds, and there's another sperm that's carrying a Z and a W chromosome, which we associate with female birds, and each of those sperm fertilizes one of those nuclei, it can actually develop into a single bird that's half male and half female, like in those photos. And you can see there's a rose-breasted grosbeak, and once again, it has that perfect division there. Another really interesting example of sort of a sexual variation within birds are something called andromorphs. And we see the classic, the male mallard at the top there with the yellow bill and the green head and the brown on the chest, and the female is a little bit more mottled and drab with that more orange bill. Andromorphs are birds that start off life with a typical female plumage and then over time develop a more male plumage. And not a lot of research has actually been done into how this happens, but the working theory is that it has to do with different levels of testosterone and an increase in testosterone as the bird gets older. But we're not entirely sure. And I've seen birds like this at High Park in Toronto and out in Burlington at the bridge there, not far from here. Oftentimes a good indication is they will still have that sort of orangey bill, although with age that can even start to change. And I've seen pictures of andromorph mallards where they look basically identical to a male. And then oftentimes only part of the head will be green, but if you look carefully, you can sometimes find them. They can be a little bit confusing because there's a lot of mallard hybrids out there, and sometimes like a black duck mallard hybrid can look a little bit like this. It's distinct as well from eclipse plumage, which is something that a lot of different types of ducks experience in the summertime. The males will lose their ability to fly while they're molting, and they'll look more like a female. And so that can also be a little bit confusing as well. There's examples of andromorphs in many different species of waterfowl, and then some other groups of birds as well, pheasants and some ground birds this has been observed in. Another really cool example of a bird which sort of challenges the sex binary in its plumage is the hooded warbler. So I took these pictures at the ROM in the ornithology collections there about 1.5 years ago, and at the top we have a typical male hooded warbler, like in the photo there, and at the bottom we have a typical female hooded warbler. And the main sort of difference between the plumage of the two we tend to think about is the male has that hood on the back of the head and that black on the throat. But you can see in the middle there's a female hooded warbler which has sort of an intermediate plumage. And similar to the andromorphs, sometimes as they get older, the female hooded warbler develops that hood. And again, we don't entirely know why, but it probably has to do with differences in levels of testosterone with age. But in some populations in the US, about 12 to 15% of the female hooded warblers are visually indistinguishable from the males. This is a photo that a researcher out in Maryland at a bird banding station named Dr. Maren Gimple sent me of an older female red-winged blackbird. And once again, probably due to changes in testosterone over the course of her lifetime, this bird is starting to develop a more male plumage as she gets older. Hummingbirds. This is really interesting. So about 25% of the nearly 200 species classified worldwide of hummingbirds, to some degree, there are female hummingbirds within that species which display a more male plumage. It's on a gradient. There are some species like this one, the white-necked Jacobin, where they look indistinguishable, like there's a portion of the females which look indistinguishable from males. And then in some species it's a little bit more subtle and variable. The working theory is that male hummingbirds are often quite aggressive during courtship, so this is actually an evolutionary strategy to avoid having the males like harassing the females, basically. So in the white-necked Jacobin, for instance, about 20% of females are, again, indistinguishable. And this is called female limited polymorphism. We talked earlier about how often we think about male birds being more colorful than female birds. Well, there's a number of species which subvert that, including the belted kingfisher here in this part of the world, which has that band of reddish brown across its chest. Another group of birds in which we find that are the phalaropes. But that's not the only way that they sort of subvert our traditional expectations around sex roles. The female phalaropes will mate with other partners and multiple males before returning to the sea to feed, but the male phalaropes are actually the ones that incubate the eggs and will raise the young. Similar to the spotted sandpiper, which is one of the more common shorebirds that we have here in Ontario. The males are the ones that incubate the eggs and raise the young, so there's a reversal in the expectations around parental care there. There's also many species of birds in which the female birds sing, and this is an area that's attracting more and more research recently. It's been documented in about 150 North American species and over 600 species worldwide, including all these species which we have here in Ontario. So it's across different families. We have flycatchers, warblers, orioles, every sort of group imaginable. There are females that sing. Another topic that I find particularly interesting is the phenomenon of sex change in animals. So we talked about the green frog earlier. It's probably the most familiar and common amphibian we have in this part of the world, or one of them. And back in 2019, a researcher out of the US named Max Lambert was studying different green frog populations and comparing them. And some of the populations were in suburban stormwater ponds that were heavily impacted by human development, and some were in pristine woodland, wetland habitats that took 2 hours to hike in, that were far away from any human settlement or pollution. And Dr. Lambert found that across those populations, green frogs were changing sex, up to 12%. And that ratio didn't change when they compared the really pristine, healthy wetlands with ones where there was more human pollution and more human impact. So the researchers that wrote that paper concluded that sex change is a totally natural part of green frog biology. And at least 2 other species of frogs, this phenomenon has been observed in as well. It occurs in many different groups of animals: amphibians, fish, crustaceans, mollusks, and there's some types of fish that can even change their sex more than once over the course of their lives. Plants have a really interesting relationship with reproduction and a lot of different strategies and systems for doing that. About 94% of the flowering plants we see around us are monoecious. So that means that they have both the pollen-producing anther, which we tend to think of as being the male reproductive parts, and the ovule-producing pistil, which we tend to think of as the female reproductive parts. So these are usually in the same flower, in what scientists call a perfect flower or a bisexual flower. Sometimes they're in different flowers on different parts of the plants. So only about 6% of flowering plants are dioecious, with separate males and females. Things like sassafras is a good example of that, and some types of maple. But that is the minority. There are rarer and more specialized reproductive systems, including trioecious plants, in which there are males, females, and individuals with both sets of reproductive organs. Androecious plants, in which there are males and plants with both sets of reproductive organs but no females. And gynandrodiecious plants, in which there are females and plants with both sets of reproductive organs but no strict males. And that includes great blue lobelia, which is a plant we have here in Ontario that you can find growing in streams and wetlands sometimes. That's related to cardinal flower. They are gynandrodiecious. Sorry, it's a very strange, difficult to pronounce word. So there are only females and individuals with both sets of organs. And there's actually been this sort of an interesting conversation around terms like male and female as they relate to plants and whether those terms are adequate. And some botanists are starting to debate that and write about that. Some people feel that those terms were sort of imported from zoology rather inappropriately, because the way that plants and animals reproduce is very, very different. And maybe we should think of different terms or better terms or think about what that might look like. So that's a really interesting conversation. A lot of plants undergo sex change as well. Some dioecious plants can change sex over the course of their lives. Jack in the pulpit, like I mentioned earlier at the start of the presentation, is a great example of this. And there's some types of maple, including striped maple and red maple, that we have here in Ontario, as well as types of yew and mulberry. Another good example is ginkgo, which is a species that we often see planted along streets or in people's yards. It's native to China. Female ginkgo trees produce this fruit that smells awful, like it smells like human feet or like Parmesan cheese. So in North America, city planners never plant female ginkgo trees. They only plant the males, but they change sex all the time. Like if you're walking in downtown Toronto, you'll often see a ginkgo tree where there's a branch or two that's fruiting, like in the fall. So they've even tried to develop like commercial cultivars of ginkgo that are more likely to stay male and not transition, but they're not foolproof. Like you can't cultivate a ginkgo that's like 100% guaranteed to stay male. So it's an issue for gardeners and horticulturalists, which is kind of funny. The exact mechanisms behind these sex changes aren't really well known. Again, there hasn't been very much research on this. There was an interesting paper, again from the 1980s, about Jack in the pulpit, suggesting that the reproductive success, it might be skewed after herbivore browsing events, like after a deer eats part of a colony of Jack in the pulpit. The next year, some of them might change to be male to sort of maximize the chance of reproductive success to help the colony recover from that feeding event. That was one working theory. In some cases, it might be due to climate change. It might be due to stress. It wasn't stressful when I did it, but there is a tree in England, this yew tree, which is about 5,000 years old. And only a few years ago, it started fruiting. It's been male for most of its existence. And they think it might have to do with climate change. But again, that's just a guess. We don't really know. Orchids. I love orchids. One of my favorite groups of living things. We have about 60 different species of orchids here in Ontario. These are all orchids I've seen across the province in the past few years. And they actually have a pistil and anther that's fused into a single reproductive structure called a column. And so it's impossible to sort of divide them and separate them apart. So because of that reason, they've been adopted as a symbol by members of the intersex community. So a lot of intersex organizations use orchids as their logo and things like that. But yeah, orchids are very cool. There are still a number of barriers and biases that we encounter. There was a really cool paper that came out of the University of Toronto last year by a researcher named Karen Anderson, where her and her team interviewed mammalogists across the world and found that the majority of them had observed same-sex sexual behavior in the species that they studied, but most of them didn't collect data on it, and an even smaller minority had ever published data on that. So there's a huge publishing gap there. There's this perception that same-sex sexual behavior is rare, and that was one of the factors that she identified in that paper as one of the main barriers preventing scientists from trying to ask those questions, trying to get funding for that research. Disparities in funding and research priorities were another huge component. Like, a lot of funding bodies didn't want to give money to this because, again, it was seen as rare, as aberrant, as something that couldn't be reproduced in multiple individuals. So why would we give you research money, if you're only going to see this once or twice? And again, like we mentioned earlier, there was that double standard where frequently other scientists and people reviewing papers, people at conferences would demand a really high burden of proof for same-sex sexual behavior that they wouldn't apply for sexual behavior in differently sexed examples of the same organisms. There's been a number of sort of explanations that have appeared in the scientific literature over the past 150, 200 years. A lot of these Bruce Baggenwald describes and sort of debunks in his work. Things like it's a dominance display, it's a form of social bonding, the animals made a mistake, they're sick, they're diseased, they're aberrant. A lot of the time when we talk about same-sex sexual behavior in mammals and birds and other animals, people will try to say that, oh, it's not actually sexual, it's serving a social function. And that, of course, ignores the fact that sex often serves a social function in humans and in other living things. Not all sex is strictly for reproduction across all sorts of different organisms. And again, there's a double standard or an inconsistency when you only apply that to same-sex sexual behavior. So here are a couple of my all-time favorites. So in 1987, this British entomologist, John Tennant, in the Entomologist Record and Journal of Variation, a scientific journal, he had observed male-male butterflies mating in Morocco, and he wrote an article about it, which he entitled, "A Note on the Apparent Lowering of Moral Standards in the Lepidoptera," which opens, "It's a sad sign of our times that the national newspapers are all too often packed with the lurid details of declining moral standards and of horrific sexual offenses committed by our fellow Homo sapiens. Perhaps it's also a sign of the times that the entomological literature appears of late to be headed in a similar direction." This was back in the Thatcher years in Britain. Another one, Dr. Valerius Geist was a Canadian mammologist who studied mountain sheep, or bighorn sheep as we sort of more commonly know them, published a book in 1975 called Man and Mountain Sheep in the Northern Wilds. There's a lot of male-male homosexual behavior in bighorn sheep. It's a very important part of their society and how they relate to one another and establish their social roles. And he has this great quote here: "To state that the males had evolved a homosexual society was emotionally beyond me. To conceive of these magnificent beasts as queers, oh God." And of course today, we encounter a number of institutional barriers. Back in 2024, in May, the National Park Service issued this internal memo severely restricting the ability of its employees to participate in Pride celebrations, including banning park rangers from attending Pride in uniform and banning any kind of Pride celebrations at national parks, which of course the National Park Service employs hundreds of biologists and science communicators and researchers at national parks and national monuments across the US. Believe it or not, this was under the Biden administration. Things have not gotten better. Things have gotten much worse over the past little while. And that's sort of an interesting thing as I've been working on my film over the past 2.5 years, as things have gotten dicier and dicier and dicier. And that's been sad, but interesting to watch. There are now certain keywords and terms that are like banned from the National Park Service website, including transgender, LGBT, and bisexual, and certain terms that are banned from research that's funded by the US government. And it's been interesting to watch that happen. So as I mentioned, in the current climate, there's this increase in hateful rhetoric, particularly in the United States and in Britain, particularly laws targeting trans people specifically. But things are bad in Canada too. We see what's happened under Danielle Smith in Alberta and Scott Moe in Saskatchewan, and even recent developments in Quebec. Things are starting to get increasingly hostile towards people like myself in this country in a way that's very disturbing. In the United States in particular, we see the censorship and suppression of research, as well as a lot of funding cuts under the Trump administration in particular. Millions and millions of dollars in science research funding has been cut, including longitudinal studies on childhood cancer and things like that. And there are now safety concerns around travel to the US. One of the researchers who I interviewed for my film at York University was planning this past spring to go to a geography conference in Detroit, but the university administration and their supervisor told them it wasn't safe for them to travel to the US. So it's not safe to cross through Windsor, Ontario to Detroit for this graduate student. And the university administration came out to tell them that because of the kind of work they were doing. That's the current climate that we're in. Fortunately, there are some really great and interesting examples of how queer humans engage with the natural world and find meaning and community by engaging with nature. We see a lot of really great outdoors groups, including the Queer Forest Club, which is based in Toronto, the Feminist Bird Club, which there's a few people here tonight from the Toronto and sort of Hamilton wings of that, but there's chapters all throughout North America and Europe and around the world. There's lots of queer birding groups that are popping up, including ones in Vancouver and Montreal, but all sorts of American cities. And there's an organization called the Queer Birders of North America, which sort of links people together. A lot of the time people, even today, but often historically as well, felt excluded from traditional nature groups, naturalist organizations, birding organizations, not just people who are queer and trans, but women. The Toronto Ornithological Club didn't allow women to be members until the 1980s, which is always fun to remind people of. People of color, Black and Indigenous people, people with disabilities. There are a number of barriers which still exist in this community and in this world. And so a lot of the time people from these communities, rather than trying to reform these existing groups, decide to start their own. There's really interesting stories of spaces like Hanlan's Point Beach in Toronto, and that's a place where piping plovers have bred. It's a Great Lakes dune ecosystem, which is an extremely endangered habitat type across North America. But it's also one of the oldest queer spaces in the world that's been, continuously enjoyed and inhabited and visited by gay and lesbian people and trans people for over 100 years. And a few years ago, the city of Toronto had this proposal to build a permanent music venue right by there. And there was a really interesting coalition where we had naturalists and birders who didn't want that to happen. But you also had members of the queer community and the trans community for different reasons who didn't want this to happen. And they were able to come together and form a coalition and say, we have different priorities, we have a different relationship with this space and a different understanding of why it's special, but we have this common goal. And they were able to go to City Hall and fight that, and the city ended up deciding not to build that music venue there. So it was a really interesting coming together of different communities for a common goal. And there's been a lot of really great artwork made as well. I talked a little bit about sort of the recent proliferation of documentaries and television specials and things like that. There's a really great piece of performance art from the 90s and 2000s with the Canadian performance artists Shauna Dempsey and Laurie Milan from Winnipeg called Lesbian National Parks and Services, where they would wear these ranger uniforms and go to places like Banff in the 90s, and people would go up to them, ask them where they can see a bison or where their hotel is, and they would start, in character, they would start talking to them about the lesbian history of the park and hand out pamphlets and things like that. So that was a really great way of sort of, challenging some of these ideas that people had. If people want to learn more, here are some great resources, some of the books that have been really important for me. We talked a lot about biological exuberance. It's incredibly in-depth and detailed, so it's a bit of a dense read, but if you really want to get into it, you definitely recommend that. Evolution's Rainbow by Joan Roughgarden, I talked a little bit about as well. That's another great read. There's a great sort of YA graphic novel about this called Queer Ducks by Elliot Sheffer that came out a few years ago. And a really great memoir that I love is called How Far the Light Reaches by Sabrina Imbler, who's a really great journalist and science writer. And it's about their life and about their identity as a non-binary person and about their queerness, but it's also about marine biology. And each chapter is divided into a different sea creature. So you can read a chapter about their relationship about their mother that's also about deep sea octopuses. It's really cool. No one's ever done it quite as well as that. Very talented writer. There was recently a Nature of Things episode hosted by Mae Martin called Fluid, Life Beyond the Binary that talked about this. There was a follow-up one that came out called, I think, Animal Pride. I never saw that one, but that was a few months ago. There's some great articles about this. There's a lot of science writing that's going on about this over the past little while. People are starting to pay more and more attention to this in a really cool way. And then I'll just plug my film a little bit. So for the past 2.5 years, I've been working on this film called Understanding Myself as an Amphibian. And it's all about queer ecology. It's all about how queer people interact with nature. It's about myself. It's a little bit autobiographical. And it's been really fun. I've got to travel to Winnipeg and New York and all over Ontario and Quebec and spend a lot of time filming turtles and frogs and birds and things like that, but also interviewing different activists and biologists and researchers and artists. And yeah, it's been an incredible process, and it's been really fun to put together. And it's very close to being finished, and I'm very excited to share it with people and go to film festivals. And hopefully people want to give me money to make more movies. Yeah, so thank you very much for coming tonight. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for that talk. I'll take show of hands if you have a question, but I'll start with one.
Yeah.
Would you happen to know if someone is out and experiencing nature and they witness something to observe two males, two females doing something that they could report to someone, or where the best spot is to share any of those sightings?
Yeah, my Instagram. It's really interesting. I interviewed Karen Anderson, that researcher out of U of T last year, and I asked Karen, I was like, is there anyone else, sort of working on this same stuff in the field that I could speak to? And she said, globally, there are about 10 or 12 people who do research into same-sex sexual behavior. So it's a very small field. But some of these, when I was doing research on gynandromorphs, a lot of that information I found in local field naturalist groups. Somebody in Idaho would photograph a lazuli bunting that was half male, half female, and that's how that record would get into the scientific literature. So something like a local naturalist group's newsletter, or even putting it out on social media or anything like that, or anyone, if you reach out to anyone who works sort of in biology, or that information can be really valuable. Something like iNaturalist even, or eBird, yeah.
Yeah, you start a project in iNaturalist and all of the sightings would go into that project.
Yeah, you could make a project. Yeah, that would be cool. No questions? Question, yes?
You mentioned gynandromorphs and andromorphs. Is there such a thing as a gynandromorph or not? Or
So, sorry, what was that?
sorry, you mentioned gynandromorphs and andromorphs. Is there such a? Oh, thank you. You mentioned gynandromorphs and andromorphs. Is there such a thing as a gynomorph?
I've never heard that term. There's a lot of the time this language wasn't totally standardized either, so sometimes you'll come across different terms. Another term you sometimes encounter is androchrome, which is I've seen with the female hooded warblers in some of those older papers, and that was again trying to indicate it's the male color, but I've never heard that particular phrase. Yeah.
Where can we watch your documentary, or when is it coming out?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. Actually, right before this presentation, I went to Kitchener because I was picking up a hard drive because someone was helping me with the edit of it. So it should be finished within the next, I would hope, 2 or 3 months. And then after that, it'll go to some film festivals if anyone wants to see it. And then maybe it'll live on the internet eventually. But yeah, I'm happy to share it with people if people are interested in seeing it. I've been working on it for a long time. I'm ready for it to be done. I'm ready for people to watch it. But it's been really fun. And it's been a great process. I've learned a lot about myself and met some really cool people.
I'm interested in different sex in turtles, because some turtles definitely you can tell male and female. Others you can't very easily. So I'm just wondering what you found out about freshwater turtles.
That's a really great question. So there's a really interesting phenomenon in most freshwater turtle species in Ontario. I think the majority of them, it's temperature-based sex determination. And so the temperature of the eggs will If it's above a certain threshold, the majority of them will be female, or more of them will be female. And if it's below a certain temperature threshold, more of them will be male. There's a rarer variation of that where it's like the median temperature, like over and below a certain threshold, more will be female. And if you're in the middle, more will be male. But that's less common across turtle species. And then in other turtle species, it is genetic. So it's a really interesting diversity of factors across different turtles populations.
Thank you. Excuse me. I found your talk to be just absolutely fascinating. It reminded me of basically a similar period back in the 1790s. And a work by Rasmus Darwin. I don't know if he's basically the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He wrote a book called The Loves of the Plants, and he used that book to explore human sexuality as well as nature, i.e. what's the relationship between human sexuality and nature. He was on the side of enfranchising and opening up gender and thinking about gender and sexuality and the relationship of the sexes in radically different ways. And so his book countered the moralistic tradition of looking to nature for rules of behavior that you wanted human beings to hold. So during this period, there were real fears that botany shouldn't even be read. Women shouldn't even look at botany because botany and plants were going to tell them some things about themselves that men and society at large didn't want them to know about.
Yeah.
So anyways, this kind of just leads into a broader question I have, and that is, in some senses, what that kind of discussion, there were moralists looking at nature and seeing how men and women should behave and how the genders should relate and all that sort of stuff, as well as counter positions being developed by people like Mary Wollstonecraft and Darwin. But often they used analogy in order to draw their conclusions. That is, they wanted to find an analogy with nature that they could apply to human life, and therefore most of their arguments were made based upon establishing an analogy between nature and human life, in which nature provided rules for human behavior. And so if you didn't see gay life operating in nature, then you shouldn't see it operating in human life either, that kind of thing. But both sides were using analogy in order to make their positions clear. What I found most effective and really interesting in your talk was that you're going the other way. You're not actually trying to figure out things in nature in order to find out how human beings behave. You're actually going the other way, which is recognizing the degree to which we're in nature. Mm-hmm. Whatever you find in human life, you can probably find also in nature, and whatever you find in nature, you can find in human life too. So there's a way in which it's, instead of a position that sets nature and human life at odds with one another and sets up those polemics, there's a much broader understanding that human beings aren't that much different than nature. So that, am I right getting?
Yeah, I think you're making a really great point here, and I think analogy is a great word. One of the most common sort of like arguments that homophobic, transphobic people will use is that it's unnatural. And a lot of writing around queer ecology, I think it almost gets into this trap where you see these articles that'll come out every once in a while that are like, well, clownfish can change their sex, and so I guess that means it's okay if people do it. And we don't want to we don't want to try to justify human queerness or transness or gayness by citing examples in nature, because even if we were the only species that, you know, exhibited transness or gayness or bisexuality or any of these things, it would be completely okay. Like, we don't need a moral justification from plants and animals in order to have these characteristics in ourselves. But at the same time, it can be really affirming and really powerful, particularly for people who have heard, you know, their entire life, you know, this part of yourself is unnatural, it's aberrant, it's shameful. If you can find, you know, Jack in the Pulpit or a green frog, and that's where the title of the film comes from. I don't literally think I'm an amphibian. I'm a transgender woman. They're different. But when I started making this documentary, I was a different gender, and learning about this stuff and reflecting on it, like making a film where I had to think about sex and gender like constantly for months and months and months, I was like, well, maybe I should figure this out closer to home. And that's what I did. So this stuff can be powerful, and that's, I think, the real value, is how affirming it can be, how we can use it to understand ourselves and relate to our own experiences. But I agree that it's really important to avoid that sort of moralistic logic, because it's the same logic that homophobes, transphobes, etc. apply from the other direction of, like, we don't observe this in animals, and so therefore you're unnatural. Nobody needs to justify these parts of themselves, but it's powerful to learn about.
Is there any more questions? Okay,
Yeah.
Oh, great presentation. I was just wondering, what causes the increase in level of testosterone in mammals? Like, is it like just like their like natural chemistry? Is it their diet? Is anyone going around with like shots of, you know, testosterone?
That's a really great question. The proper answer to that is that's mostly speculation. Like, we really haven't done very much research on that. There was some sort of scientific writing in the 18th century in which a British naturalist found a female pheasant that was starting to change plumage and look a little bit more male. And the speculation at the time was that the ovary was damaged. And so sometimes you'll actually encounter that too when you read about andromorphs. But I don't think that, like, the number of them that I've seen over the years and how common it is, I don't think all these mallards have crushed ovaries. I think, yeah, if there's a biologist out there that wants to do this research, I think it would be incredibly cool to do. But I guess all our hormone levels change over time. Like, we think, like, when humans go through menopause, like, a lot of the time there's an increase in hormone levels. And one time I was talking to my mom about this, about the female hooded warblers who, like, start to get the hood as they get older, and she was like, oh, just like my mustache. So yeah. Any other questions?
Got two more.
Two more?
Great presentation, it was so great. I was curious, what began your interest in ecology, and then like at what point did the idea of like queer ecology, like when did that synthesize for you, or is that even the order that like that went in? Like, what was your sort of entry point into this area of study?
Yeah, great question. I've always loved nature, like ever since I was a little kid. I've always loved hiking and wildlife and, you know, watching nature films and reading books about that since I was very young. And I've been queer for a long time. And yeah, I started to notice probably around 2019 some of these articles that were coming out. Like I saw a news article about Max Lambert's study on the green frogs. And I think that was, and then I also saw the picture of the cardinal that Shirley Caldwell took in Erie, Pennsylvania. And so I sort of had this idea in my head that I was starting to put together these pieces of like, this is an interesting pattern, this is an interesting pattern, this is something that's sort of similar to my own experience but different. And I started to put those together, and at the time there wasn't really a film that anyone had made about it. A few people have beat me to it since then, but mine's going to be better.
You mentioned like the question of whether animals can experience gender, and like you mentioned those, like in this book, I forget the name of the species you mentioned, the fish and the brown bluegill. The brown bluegill.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm remember reading about this group of apes, I think it may have been chimpanzees, that where it was observed that the group was tended to be dominated by some very authoritarian dominant males, and the group of males that eventually ended up eating. They lived on the edge of a city or something, and they ended up eating some food that had been contaminated, and they died. And then the social dynamic became generally more what's the word? Egalitarian. Again, I'm only vaguely remembering this, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that as humans we tend to think that we were apart from the natural world, and I guess one part of that is assuming that we're the only ones that have a society, a social life, and I get that again. There's not to diminish the difference between humans and other species, but also to what extent is there have there been changes like that been documented, or to what extent do some species have more of a social life or society and others don't?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's interesting, that question of anthropomorphism, or what makes us uniquely human or distinguishes us from other animals. That's been a part of science all the way back into the 18th century and even earlier. And under the sort of the Christian tradition, there is a very clear separation between humans and other animals. And we've tried to find some sort of criteria to codify that, whether it's tool use or the use of language. But every time we try to come up with something like that, we find examples in other animals. Now we know that lots of animals use tools, chimps and even octopuses and things like that. And we understand that lots of animals, use sound to communicate in what could be, considered language. The other question about the sort of the complexity of social lives of different animals, it varies a lot depending on the species. Some animals are, very solitary. Some of them live in very complicated social groups. I think the example you gave of the apes and chimpanzees, those are some of the most rich and fascinating examples of animal social groups and societies. And a lot of research is, throughout the 20th century has focused on that. And apes, particularly the great apes, that's probably some of the most detailed research on same-sex sexual behavior in any group of animals. They find it in almost every individual species of primate, and it's extremely prevalent in species like bonobos and chimps. So yeah, really interesting stuff to read about.
Say you get a lot of positive feedback from YouTube chat.
Oh, wow.
So, just curious if you have studied what goes on with white-throated sparrows.
Yeah, this is another cool example.
Yeah.
So there's, in white-throated sparrows, species we have here in Ontario, familiar to a lot of us, some have the tan stripe and some have the white stripe, and there are tan stripe males, white stripe males, you get it. There's 4 different divisions, and they tend to pair. I think it's the opposite. I can't exactly remember off the top of my head, but I think it's the tan tends to go for the white striped. And there is a difference in one being more aggressive and extroverted and one being a little bit, sort of more meek. So again, there seems to be this weird, really fascinating division of gender roles there, if we want to frame it that way. And it's contentious and not all scientists agree, but it's a really cool possibility to think about. And that's very recent research. That's only come out in the past, sort of 4 or 3 years.
Any final questions? What's some of the love that's been happening online?
Jackson reads the comment.
It's all so small, I can't even. Yeah. But it's just a lot of thanks for your work and your time and for coming out tonight. I think the next time you're back, hopefully we can organize a screening, a playhouse.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah.
On behalf of the Naturalist Club and so much, May, for coming out and presenting. One last round of applause. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you so much.
So good.